Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to September's webinar. This webinar is something that we haven't really done too much with before, but we're going to get a really we're going to get some experience from the people that have gone through it. So how do we do end of semester exams online? This is going to be something really interesting to do. Please feel free to ask plenty of questions using the chat and the Padlet board that Logan we'll be putting up on the screen shortly. But once again, please feel free to ask as many questions as you want, and I'll now hand over to Logan to take us through it today.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone from sunny Melbourne. We're locked in, but we're doing well. Thanks for your love. I'm super excited to be part of this conversation today because I think assessments are critical to the student experience, critical to everything that we do as part of institutions, universities, but often not something we have the space, time, or often will to kind of redesign or reinvent. I'm very excited today to be joined by a fantastic group of panelists. So from UTS, we have Professor Marianne Deva and Emerson Sunadi, who are both intricately involved in the project to migrate the exams online from different capacities and roles and perspectives, which they'll bring to the conversation. And from all the way from Manila, from the La Salle University, we have Dr. Jasper Alantoga and Dr. Christine Joy Bayada, who similarly were also deeply involved in their movement to take the exams online, both in terms of supporting, designing some of the courses and how they would function in Canvas, but also critically developing the capacities of staff to do that, right? Because I think that's the key thing, helping people feel confident and capable to not just take that content online, but also facilitate, to teach, to assess that, and to really own it. The structure of what we're trying to do today. So I'm a bit ambitious. Go big or go home is my philosophy, and I never go home. So I've the kind of outline for the presentation today. We're hoping to go through these points to tell a broad kind of narrative of the story. I put a link to the Padlet wall over here. So if you've got questions, comments, ideas, feel free to put them in the chat. But if you can also jump into the Padlet wall and you can post your question there, you can add a comment, you can like something that someone else has posted, right? I'm hoping this will be a better way to structure our conversation. And I will take the questions to the panelists at the point in which we are reaching them in the conversation, or they might also just look at the question and jump into that. And then at the end of the webinar, we can export this wall and you can have a list of all the questions and resources that either you as a collective community online have put together, or we from the Canvas team could jump in and add things there. Right, that's it. That's all my housekeeping. The last thing I'll mention is that if any point my 3-year-old jumps into the screen and shares something on the webinar, he has many interesting ideas to share. So I'm going to stop sharing.
I may encourage this.
What was that, Adam?
I said I may encourage them.
Start them young. So we'll start by just giving us a little bit of the context, the background of the story. What happened in that first semester, how did it happen? And then from there talk about why maybe explain some of the decisions. Will give us some context to understand why we made the decisions we made. In our pre-chat, Marianne, you were saying, you landed off a plane and then you were told, we need to change this in a matter of weeks. Was it? Can you take us back there a little bit and give us a summary?
Yeah, in February, I was traveling through Singapore and the UK, and I got back to Australia in mid-February. And the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Education and Students met me when I got back and said, online assessment, academic integrity, could you look at that? My role up to that point had been as academic lead on our University of Technology Sydney, our transition from Blackboard to Canvas. So I was already in the kind of learning technology space. So at that point, we had cohorts of international students, around about 4,000 offshore, and we understood that they would be delayed and maybe potentially wouldn't make it to Australia before the end of that teaching session. So I was to look at how we could provide high integrity assessment for students who were offshore, roll on a couple of weeks. And of course, it became clear that the situation was going to envelop Australia as well. And, you know, by mid-March, we've got a situation where we're looking at putting or needing to put all of our end of session final assessments online. So that's when we really had to kind of pull, you know, a growing team together. We ended up between 20 and 30 of us focusing on this. And we were kind of an augmented exams, you know, program, really. Normally we would have at our university at the end of our first teaching session, probably 65,000 individual exam sittings. So that's the scale of what we were trying to look at doing. Ultimately, what happened was that when we went out to talk to staff about this, we need to remember that at this point, people had already established what their assessment was going to be. So we're really needing to make some fairly rapid changes. Some staff actually opted to redo their assessment into the form of an assignment, not have it as an exam. Ultimately, we ended up offering staff options of 4 types of exams. So human invigilation, AI invigilation, a non-invigilated exam through the LMS, and a take-home exam also through the LMS. So that's what we ended up having to kind of engineer solutions for in probably around about 12 weeks. So that was us.
Great, thanks for that, Marianne. I want to get into that, the choices that staff made and that 4 things. I think that's a really nice way to summarize different options that we have moving forward. But I want to give our colleagues from the LSU an opportunity to share their context a little bit. So did you have 5 weeks to transition everything online, Jasper, or 5 days, 5 months? What was your story like?
Yeah, in our case here in the Philippines, it was really the start of March actually that we started the community quarantine, and based on our calendar, we were at week 9 of our second term, 9 out of 14 weeks. So we're almost right into our final exam period. And as you can imagine, most, as what Mary Ann mentioned, most of the teachers already have set final assessments for their courses. And the beauty, I guess, in our university is, of course, there's full academic freedom, especially for HEI teachers, on their assessment. And an assessment can be very varied. Like our graduate courses, we would usually not give exams, but more focus on research project, case studies, presentations. Whereas for the undergraduate, there are really some programs that are more of departmental exams, which again, those are the courses that were greatly affected when it comes to transitioning those final assessment online. But I guess for those courses that are not really are doing more of alternative assessment, even before the pandemic, the transition was much more smoother for them because it's more of assessment is being done throughout the term. So, and not just really dependent on that high stake final examination. Yeah, so our teachers basically, we were supposed to end the term April, okay, but we ended up ending the term, I think, mid-May. So just to give options for teachers to, 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 to postpone their exams in that sense as they move it online.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the focus will be, I suppose, on the teachers who were faced with these high stakes end of semester exams and how they reacted to that. I'm interested to know if there was much of a, Marianne, you mentioned that there were these options of AI proctoring, human proctoring, and then the redesign. What was the reaction from the staff? it would seem that if you had a human proctored exam before, the natural impulse would be to have a online proctored exam.
You would think that, and it was quite interesting that some of the people who would previously forcefully argued I need to have an invigilated final exam suddenly started to shift around a bit. I think it was partly that people had very little knowledge of what an online, proctored exam would look like and how it would operate. And I think some of them were a bit anxious about the complexities of that. We also know, I think, let's be honest, there was a lot of chat in the media about, the nature of these exams and what that experience felt like for students. And so we did have some entire faculties say, actually, we won't have any proctored exams. We won't have any human proctored exams. Other faculties said, well, for the purposes of external accreditation, for example, in accounting, we have to have a human proctored exam. So we ended up with faculties making quite different decisions based on their individual circumstances. And I was very comfortable with that because I think that way we had people actually staying, as far as possible within their comfort zone, and we were responding to their use cases. Ultimately, across the university, we ended up only scheduling 5 human invigilated exams for the whole session, which is considerably less than the number of subjects that would have had those human invigilators had we actually been on campus. We had a larger number of AI invigilated exams, but quite a lot of staff actually opted not to have the invigilation. And there were a variety of reasons for those. I think in some respects, it had to do with staff perhaps rethinking what their intentions were and their needs were for final assessments. I think if I'm honest, I think some staff also feared the complexity because they, unlike sending a paper exam paper off to the exam section and then having that exam run in a building somewhere off campus that they don't, even have to turn up to, suddenly the exam paper's back with them and they're having to build in the LMS the environment for offering that exam. And I think that in itself was a challenge if some staff weren't particularly skilled up. And I think if we were then to add the layer of invigilation, I think they began to wonder whether or not this was actually too much for them to manage, let alone their students. We also know that, quite a few of the students had questions and anxieties around the nature of proctored exams, and I think did put some pressure on subject coordinators to say this is not something that we want. So often that wouldn't come through to us in the central team, but it would come through to the subject coordinators and they would respond and then start sending us messages about what they did or didn't want to do. So I think it was something that, it evolved fairly rapidly. The conversations evolved very rapidly and people needed to make decisions. I think it's entirely possible for the next round of exams, which we're currently starting to prepare for now, that we will see people making completely different decisions about assessment for the session that they're in now, based on the experiences that they had in the previous one. And I think in terms of where we might all go, medium to long term, a lot of learning from this current session will inform what we'll do, but I think the picture would look quite different.
Thanks, Marianne. Jasper and Christine, I see you nodding vigorously away as Marianne was talking. Was this similar to the sort of conversation that was happening at the LSU around proctoring? Maybe Christine, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I think those same issues are also, being considered with regards to proctoring, especially when the pandemic happened. We were not, many of us teachers also were not really using Canvas for the quiz function even of Canvas, because you're so used to doing all our assessments face to face. And even if we've tried it with pre-pandemic, there were also some resistance actually from some students. They're not very comfortable. Our students themselves were not very comfortable about taking an online quiz or exam. And so that was something also we had to consider. And the difficulty really of proctoring, we couldn't even, some of us couldn't imagine how it would happen, right? And considering as well that we have to think about the cost of acquiring, for example, software that will allow us to do the AI invigilated exam. So that's also something that we needed to think about. So for some teachers really in the university, when the pandemic happened and we had to do the final exams, most of them really opted to do it also asynchronously, to level up the type of questions that they were asking. Instead of asking lower order thinking questions, they had to come up with higher order kind of questions. The ones that students, no matter how much they Google, they won't be able to find the answers to those questions, right? So we also had to consider as well our internet connectivity issues. And as you know, our internet connection in the Philippines is quite unstable. And so if we do live exams online, then we we can imagine that many students would really find some difficulty with that, and they might get cut off, and it also adds to their anxiety. And so those were the considerations that we had to think about, whether we wanted to really do a proctored exam or not.
You raise a really interesting point of not just being having to shift to a new medium, but almost rethink the way you're assessing students and starting to assess a different order of thinking, maybe even to a different outcome, maybe an outcome that wasn't really assessed before. So I like to talk about that aspect a bit more. Did you find, I like to understand how much that happened overall, and how you supported staff to do that, and how some of that would look like in Canvas, because we're getting to that. I think the question we're trying to answer, and we have a question on the board around academic integrity, right? So how do we ensure academic integrity without invigilation? Not that invigilation is a guarantee of integrity, of course, but often it's a nice big marker to say that you're doing something around integrity. So let's start talking about those design considerations, right? So moving on from what you were just saying, Christine, that of academics having to reinvent and redesign their exams. What were some other ways we saw academics, or you helped those academics to change the way they were assessing their assessments?
That's right. We had to think about the most important or the most essential learning outcomes really that we wanted to assess. And we had to go back to that and check out what was in our syllabus, and were there some things that, you know, these are things that we don't really need to test in an objective manner, but maybe we can do like some kind of assessment that will require students to apply concepts, to raise the kind of thinking that we are asking from them, and then design the assessments in that way. So I was actually part of the team that created a blueprint course for one of our GE or general education courses that's being taken by all students in the university. And so we had to look at our final assessments and decide whether we're going to do it the way we planned it originally, because it was created for a face-to-face environment. And we redesigned it and came up with something simpler also that can be done asynchronously, although students will still have to submit it via Canvas. But it was, in a way, we did not sacrifice the quality of the assessment, but we instead like really just focus on what's the most important, what's the core competency that we really want our students to get from this whole learning experience. And that guided us, I think, and I think that's something that also should guide all teachers, especially now that we are in this pandemic. I mean, there's just so many learning competencies or outcomes we want, but what's the most essential? What's the most important one that we want to really focus on? And we design our assessments around that most essential learning competency.
If I could just jump in there. I mean, I think that one of the really magical things to come out of this was to really engage our academic staff, as we have had great difficulty doing up to now, on questions to do with quality assessment design. And I think, as you say, one of the things that perhaps dismayed some staff but kind of warmed my heart was when they realised that the exam paper that they had, you know, previously used and possibly used actually wasn't fit for purpose when you went to kind of deliver it online through the LMS. And in particular, moving away, I think, from that kind of, factor information retrieval style of question to something that actually does involve higher order thinking. So we spent quite a lot of time resourcing staff in how to transform those exams. And those transformations also added, as you pointed out, to the academic integrity elements, creating exams that really are not as susceptible to to cheating and to collusion, which actually do require students to give something of themselves, in their responses. And we also used it as an opportunity to encourage staff to have a proper engagement with students around questions of academic integrity. Why does academic integrity matter? What are our expectations for you around these assessments? And I think that that's, something that, rather than simply sort of saying, how can a proctored solution prevent cheating? Actually sort of say, what are we doing here at a university? Why does integrity matter? What does it mean about the skills and the knowledge that you have and where you might go after graduation? So I think to that extent, it was actually really quite a useful exercise. And I think, at our university, it's really kicked on a very healthy discussion about assessment design. And as you say, really coming to grips with what are the learning outcomes we really need to assess here and what's the best way in which we can do that. But I grant you as well, there were staff who were really kind of unfamiliar with the tools in the LMS. So getting that together with how they were reimagining the exams was a very, very steep learning curve. And I think some of our staff found that, utterly exhausting in relation to what they previously understood the process of creating, and sending off their final exams to the exams branch.
Marianne, I've got a question for you. Do you think that obviously COVID's allowed you to, obviously there's a lot of work and a lot of stress that goes into both the creators of these exams and the students themselves. But do you also think that that was the catalyst that has really pushed you, as you said, they've really started to open their eyes to the future of how this is going to look? Do you think that this is obviously accelerated rapidly because what has happened this year, or do you think eventually we were going to get there, but just over a longer period of time?
I actually think it would have taken us quite a deal of time longer. I think this has been an amazing kick on. And the thing that was really exciting was, seeing staff who previously just would never have imagined that they could ever be involved in something like this. And then within a couple of months, they're in it. And staff saying things like, oh, this quiz is automatically marked. Kind of like, hell, who hadn't told me about that? So we've got all these people suddenly going, oh, yeah, count me in. So I'm not hearing a lot of voices saying, I can't wait to get back to the way we used to do things. I suspect in terms of our technology roadmap, getting, substantially into online exams would have taken us quite, a few more years. And now we're kind of in it. And I think we're really just trying to now fine tune what our use cases are, what the scale of our needs are, and what it means for how we will imagine our assessment going forward. But I mean, one of the things that, and I know we were going to talk about, supporting students and staff, and about, how successful was this, but this was actually, I think, a challenging experience for staff. They had to do a lot of work that they previously had, it either didn't exist in that form or actually was undertaken by the exams branch. So there was a real shift in where the labour was taking place. So bless our staff, they did that. They hadn't been expecting to do it. And I think if we go forward in this space, then that's going to have to become part of staff's understanding and part of their workload in terms of, actually teaching, delivery and assessment. So I think it was harder for staff in some respects. For students, the feedback that we got is, despite obvious anxiety because this was a new kind of phenomenon, we actually found that students experienced it as so much less stressful than actually sitting in what was often a very cold exam room at that time of year, having already travelled several hours perhaps by public transport to get there. They were sitting at home in a comfortable environment that they knew, with equipment that they understood. And indeed, one of the things that was pointed out by, for both students and staff, students were able to type their exams so much easier than handwriting, because nobody handwrites, you know, at length anymore. And staff actually could read students' handwriting. And later, when we were looking at the fact that in some subjects, the sort of students, you know, average marks had gone up in this session compared to previous sessions, there were a number of sort of theories, you know, was this the result of cheating? You know, what was happening here? But what actually came out was people were saying the staff can read the writing now, you know, so it actually understanding what students are putting forward. So there's all these things that we never quite perhaps understood were happening, you know, in that sort of conventional exam setting, where we're actually now seeing considerable improvements. We also saw that, you know, at our university, students' take-up of anxiety-related exam workshops through the counselling service were down, and other exam-related presentations were down. When we looked at, you know, things like student complaints, the total number of complaints that went through, formal complaints to student complaints in relation to online exams, was 4. You know, that's just extraordinary. You know, I think it says as an experience that students actually found this a positive.
Can you give us an idea of what that number is usually?
I don't have an actual number for you, but considerably higher than that. And there were
we'll just leave it there. We don't want to get anyone in trouble, all right? Like we're just going to leave that right there, okay?
but similarly, the special considerations associated with exams were way down. There were a whole lot of, you know, data points we could look at to say, well, if we're looking at our students, they're having, you know, a much better experience. It's not to say that it was completely trouble-free. And if any students had technology issues on the day, then it just multiplied their sense of, you know, the pain associated with exams. I think the thing to remember as well is, you know, students don't like exams. Who does? You know, so it's never going to be a completely trouble-free zone for any of us. But certainly by key measures, it was a better experience. And I think we have to pay attention to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I've heard that from other institutions as well, that special exemptions were down almost 70%. And not proportional to the number, less exams were being offered, but still not proportional to the number of exams that were dropped. I want to bring you into this, Jasper. I think, you know, we're moving ahead to talk about the point about students, but let's talk about students. They are why we do what we do. Did you get the same sort of feedback from students in DLSU? What was their experience like with the exams?
Well, in our case, the feedback is really varied because there are some colleges, as I said, that would tend to, even before the pandemic, already lean more towards alternative assessment. So for those students, it was really not a big issue that their exams are, meaning most of the time what they would have are formative assessments. But we were getting feedback from our students, especially for the sciences. Okay, wherein some of their teachers are giving, to some extent, more exams, more formative exams. Okay, and they would say even a bit of an overload of their formative exams. Okay, and we really and we want to open this discussion as well back to our teachers. Okay, because um, formative exam is good, and to some extent we were really promoting it to our teachers because we are subscribed to Studio, and we know that for the pandemic teachers will be moving into the Studio, and we were promoting the use of video quizzes in Studio, so as a way of formative assessment, and to that sense that might be a reflection of that feedback from students. But what our students really, I think what was very clear in the feedback of our students is that the teachers were really more forgiving this term compared to face-to-face terms. Okay, like the teachers understand that the different personal circumstances, and there was really no discussion whether students are making the internet as an excuse. That's why they cannot take the exam. But it's really more of, again, as teachers being forgiving of students, and students feeling that I don't want to say leniency, but considerations for students, and meaning teachers are more open for multiple attempts, for example, in their exams. Okay, so on our end, we also, of course, would like to caution our teachers, try to also reflect on, because we don't have a proctoring software in our university. So what we have really is the Canvas quiz tool. So we try to tell them, using the quiz statistics, okay, what can you infer from the quiz statistics, okay, and just for you to get hints on any inappropriate behavior of your students. But most of the time, it's really the forgiving aspect of teachers in their, as they move to online assessment, as a positive feedback from our students.
Thanks, Jasper. I think that's really useful. And I think that just having, you know, as Marian was saying earlier, having to kind of be personally involved with the exam gave them more transparency around what they were asking students to do. Perhaps, Emerson, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here, because we're talking about staff, and I know you worked a lot with staff to develop their skills. And there's a question around how some of the particular strategies that we use to model professional development with staff. So I think people want to know what the approach was, what particular models used, what particular resources used. And I'll also be really interested to hear if there were any trends, like so that staff trend towards any particular assessment approach in Canvas, you know, so things that we could suggest basically the listeners to use.
So on the point of supporting staff, essentially there were sort of two collective groups that we had to work with. So just to give a bit of context, you know, supporting staff wasn't just the academic staff which were supporting and, you know, running these exams, but also sort of professional staff that would traditionally have run the exams on behalf of the academics. So we sort of had two sort of distinct groups with sort of different requirements and different needs. I might start off with the professional staff work first. So in terms of the context of professional staff, some of the requirements were, or some of the digital proficiencies were quite varied. A lot of them never needed to use the learning management system until now, because previously for paper examination, that you can imagine, did not require them to jump into the learning management system to moderate, administer, and supervise exams. So to sort of address, you know, address sort of issues around that, there are a lot of things to sort of work out. So in terms of for professional staff, there was a lot of administrative processes and business processes that we had to look at in terms of how would this be achieved within the learning management system. These were sort of then, these training plans were then sort of drafted up to help support these staff to administer these sort of business processes. Now, given that we're sort of in the change, we're sort of in between two learning management systems, that sort of compounded the issue or compounded the problem, meaning that there was a lot more training required across two different systems, and, you know, trying to familiarize, you know, yourself with two platforms does take a bit of time, but other sort of initiatives of support that we provided in that front was just to basically chip in and provide human resourcing to ensure that, you know, the administrative staff that are involved in that process felt that they had the support required, and that, you know, any deadlines that needed to be achieved as part of exams could be done. This also included drafting up, you know, various forms of technical documentation that would support those business processes. So, you know, these would traditionally not live anyway because they're quite, you know, university specific. So those were sort of drafted on demand and rapidly and based on those business requirements. In terms of academic staff, I can't talk too much on the design of the exam itself. I believe Marianne would be able to add a little bit more to that. Marianne, did you want to add in how we sort of communicated and how we sort of educated our staff around the design exams before I move on to the technical training side of things?
Yeah, we obviously understood this was going to be a massive change, and from our point of view, really there was almost no process associated with offering, you know, paper exams that went unchanged as we moved over into the online one. So the kinds of business processes that Emerson's talking about, they really were substantial. And just take for one example, you know, how were we going to ensure the security of exams that were being developed in the LMS? I think that was a critical point. In terms of staff, we ran we were already in the process, because of COVID and the need to pivot to online teaching, in the process of offering a vastly ramped up suite of resources and webinars for academic staff around a whole host of areas of online delivery. So the exams kind of slotted into that. And so we started to provide different kinds of resources to academic staff in terms of the different exam types that they might want to consider, and how we would define those types, where we would see them being best deployed. Then we would have a look at what kinds of affordances there were in the different LMS if staff weren't familiar with those. So in some respects we were running both training, professional development around redesigning exams, according to what type of exam you might be planning to offer, and then looking at how we could also then support staff to be building those exams in the LMS. So it was really quite a high pressured and complex set of processes that we had to actually work with staff. And we also were often running roadshows through faculties, because some of the differences among the kinds of exams that were run in different faculties really meant that a sort of a one-size-fits-all training program didn't really work. So for example, we had people who needed to be doing hand workings or drawings, or drawing solutions for exams. So we needed to work with them. What's the best way we can do that in an online environment? And that was much more needed in some faculties than in others. So it was ultimately quite a complex and fast-moving set of training that we were offering both centrally and out in faculties, and again offering it primarily online. I think there was a little bit of face-to-face, but that was usually also being beamed out to people who were watching from Zoom.
And I guess on that point, I think I jumped in there.
That's all right, go for it. I wanted to highlight the example Marianne brought up around handwriting assessments, right? I think whenever we have this conversation, there's always going to be these edge cases, and often the edge cases end up becoming the kind of take over the kind of narrative. But it is something that people are quite interested in. How do you service that particular need, or how do you do if you need to assess observational assessments, for example, we have a question around that one. If there is a professional accreditation question, a need for invigilation, how are those needs met? So I don't want to interrupt what you're going to say, Emerson, because I think you're going to talk more about how the training happened. But if you can litter more of these specific examples, I think the audience would be interested to hear some of them.
So on the design of exams front, that we sort of done in UTS, because a lot of the exams were already preset in advance. So a lot of these hand calculation-based exams, or a lot of the exams that require had specific learning outcome that needed to be achieved in a certain way, they're already defined. We had to sort of come up with different initiatives, different sort of solutions around that. So solutions around just to take the hand-based calculation one in place to ensure sort of that sort of similar exams could be achieved in an online environment. What the UTS recommendation was that essentially was that if there was a hand-based calculation, to see whether or not one can just be redesigned in an online fashion using the native LMS functionality. Two, if it can't be replicated, are there workarounds for it? So the workaround that we sort of suggested was that put your answer online, put your exam online, put your answers online, and what you can do is that you can actually do the handbook answer on paper and then submit that after the examination. So depending on which examination type you chose to adopt for your assessment, the idea would be that you can still do those sorts of assessments and upload those sort of hand calculations afterwards.
Can I just jump in there as well? We also had a really fantastic member of staff, Natalie Lloyd from Engineering and IT, and she was also showing staff how, rather than getting students to do the calculations, you could give them a calculation and they could actually write a discursive response to some element of it. Perhaps describing where it's correct, where it goes wrong, what the alternatives would be. So that she was road showing that around a lot of faculties to sort of say it doesn't always have to be this way. You can flip it. So I think those were kind of exciting innovations as well.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And we have a few questions around that too, around how else we can innovate the redesign question, to redesign that question. So I was wondering if Christine or Jasper want to jump in here, because I know early on, Christine, you were talking about getting lecturers to, or teachers to think, to assess the higher order aspects of an assessment. So are there any outstanding examples, or doesn't it be outstanding, things that just kind of jump to your mind?
Yeah, maybe I should share what we just did for our master's degree program. We recently finished the written comprehensive exam. So this is a high stakes exam that they all have to take in order for them to graduate. So we didn't want to proctor it because, as Jasper pointed out, we really don't have proctoring software right now in the university. And the way for us to do it was we created a Canvas course. Jasper created a Canvas course for us. And we added the students there who were supposed to take the exam. And then we sent in the exam questions on the same day of the exam. And then they were given 4 hours to do it asynchronously. And then they just had to upload it. But the main difference really was we wanted to make sure that the questions was something that, you know, they won't be able to answer this question if they won't draw from their own personal experiences. So we had to contextualize the questions in their own practice also, because this is at the MA level, at the master's level, and these were counselors in training and in-service teachers, and some are actually already school administrators taking their PhD in educational psychology as well as a PhD in counseling psychology. So we really wanted to give them questions that will challenge them, that will also require them to look at theory and integrate the theory that they have learned in their coursework, as well as with practical situations. So we prepared, I guess it's just like 3 questions, but it's a kind of questions that you need 4 hours to answer, right? And they were able to submit it through by uploading their work, you know? And just to also make sure that there's a backup plan, because of our internet connection, we also asked them to email it to us. And yeah, when I talked to the students after the exam and I got their feedback, they did say that the idea of not being proctored lessened somehow their anxiety, because the feeling of someone like on a Zoom call looking over your shoulder while you're answering could actually cause a lot of anxiety also. And we didn't want that, because we know that the whole exam taking experience is already very stressful, and we didn't want that for our students. So we trusted them. Of course, we gave an orientation even before the exam, and we explained to them even the consequences, no? If they were to do anything that was, you know, not appropriate. But I think we were able to, you know, carry out that whole exam well, and we also got good feedback from the students, which we hopefully can continue to improve on also for the next term that we give the exam again. So yeah.
Yeah. And if I can jump on to what Ma'am Tin mentioned. So it was really because teachers would have the liberty, of course, to set their assessment procedure. So we had to give them a lot of ideas of how they can do their exams alternatively. Okay, and some teachers responded like instead of written exams, they would now have oral comprehensive examinations. Okay, for their students. Okay, or ask them as students to really do a video recording instead of taking an online quiz. Okay, so these are, and then there are even some teachers who I know from the College of Engineering that would even ask their students to develop the questions, and then from that pool of questions, the teacher would select which one the class would answer. So some champions, some teachers are really experimenting, meaning since this is our first time to be full online, some have taken it as an opportunity to really innovate their assessment, and we feel that these are very good. These are good times to innovate. Since you're moving online, then might as well try to innovate as much as possible.
Yeah, indeed. The risks are low to change, and the environment is open and encouraging people to try new and different things. Right. So on the topic of trying new and different things, I think we still have there's some questions here around what features of Canvas you think work best for exams. I don't think we want to go into very technical and talking about specific different features. But I think there is still an appetite from the audience to understand how we overcome this fear of cheating, basically. Right. So maybe we need to talk a little bit about that specifically. I know we've been talking about it throughout, but were you worried that students would cheat? Did you get these cases of how do we address that? And what would you say to someone who is worried about that?
Okay, can I start?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so in our case, we mentioned we were very transparent to the teachers and say that no online exam is cheat proof. Okay, I think it was very important for teachers to realize that. We hinted, for example, that you might want to lower the percentage of your online exams and then just assign more percentage for alternative assessment. Um, Teachers would report that when they were comparing their face-to-face assessment to online assessment, like students tend to get higher scores in online exams compared to their face-to-face exams before. So that gives them somewhat an idea that something is up and about. So we tell them to look into really the quiz statistics and look at, for example, how much time it took for that particular student to take the exam. Okay, and because that would give a direct hint whether the student already have the answers before taking the exam. So rather than just relying on the score or the total scores, so we tell the teachers to dive a little deeper to the quiz statistics. Of course, for written documents, we do have our Turnitin software that checks the academic integrity. So there was really not a big issue in terms of checking the integrity of written of paperworks. Okay, so those are some of our practices.
Thanks, Jasper. I think that's a really good point on higher scores alone not being an indicator that students are cheating. Maybe it's they're performing more comfortably, there's less stress, and there are other maybe more reasonable indicators. Marianne, I feel like you want to jump in there too.
Yeah, look, I think that mirrors a lot of our experience. I think staff generally underestimate the integrity that can be delivered through the face-to-face large exam hall environment. There's a lot goes undetected there. I think absolutely the really invigorated conversation around the relationship between assessment design and academic integrity has been one of the real boons here. I guess the biggest debate that we had was around the exam window. And we set that at, trying to remember the exact, I think it was 6 hours was the minimum, because we were trying to basically balance the load across the time period. We also had students who were in different time zones, and we were trying to sort of capture that. So students could do a 2-hour exam at any point in that 6-hour period. But staff did report to us that they felt that just did leave too many opportunities for students to get in early, to do the paper and then share. So we did find some evidence of collusion. So this time round, we will shorten that window and give less time. But as I said, our considerations there were multiple to do with sort of, server load and time zones. I mean, I think we also need to sort of think here in terms of the overall environment that we're in. And I think one of the options that I saw in some literature recently was, if we're concerned that students are going to go out on the internet and start looking for answers, why don't we design questions that require them to go out on the internet and find really good answers, assess, the quality of the resources that they can find there, in order to respond to particular kinds of things. So I think if we open our minds to sort of thinking about the actual environment we're in, we might be more creative and save us a lot of labor trying to police something if we can actually flip it and say, okay, yes, you're out there, the internet's available. Go and get us a good set of resources to respond to this particular challenge that we've got. So I think that, you know, academic integrity will probably remain an issue in this space as it is in any kind of assessment space. But I think there's definitely things as we get more familiar with this environment and get more comfortable with experimenting and redesigning our assessment, I think we can probably go some more interesting places than a kind of a surveillance and policing approach to what we're doing here. I think the other thing is this was the first time that many staff had done this. And I think once they get more familiar with what they can do with quiz tools, for example, we will actually get more interesting, I think, and rigorous kinds of testing taking place in those environments.
I think, Marianne, as well, the coming back to what you said on that earlier is that I mentioned it in the chat as well. And I think Paul's also coming up with creating questions and assessments. Like, we might be developing new styles of assessments and quizzes that might come out of this to help encourage those sorts of things to help develop. So in next questions, everyone's like, oh, they can just go to the internet and cheat. What happens if it doesn't involve words? What happens if it's a recording? What happens if we've got to do it back that way? I mean, there's so many different ways to think outside the box, but a lot of people need to obviously step through that door to realize that this is actually possible. And yeah, we're quietly excited about what can come over the next, you know, foreseeable future.
And I think those co-creation opportunities are actually going to be really, really exciting going forward.
Yeah,
you know, because I think up to now, I think without COVID, the assessment space, it was a bit set and forget. You know, we sort of thought we understood the sort of parameters.
Bit of complacency on behalf of people writing it and marking it, thinking that's the way it's always been done.
That's the way it's, yeah, exactly. That's good. That's fit for purpose. And I think you're right that, you know, now that we're in this space, we can actually think differently. But as I think, you know, as you know, Emerson and the team highlighted, it actually takes a lot more to support staff to do good assessment and to understand the processes, you know, within which assessment sits in this environment than it does in the paper environment. I don't know if Emerson wants to add anything more to that.
No, not much more to further add. I guess the only comment is that, yeah, in terms of availability windows, we are sort of reducing it to try to address some of the academic integrity concerns that some academics may have. All in all, though, we have found that the staff experience has been very positive about online exams, and that they are very, you know, welcoming of, you know, the new sort of process we're introducing this time around. Yeah, I think as Adam was sort of alluding to, once you show staff the, you know, various possibilities of what you can do and how this actually can, you know, enrich the students' learning experience, they can get really creative with what they do. So I'm excited to see what happens this time around.
On that note of the excitement of what's going to happen this time around, just looking forward, what do you think is going to happen this time around? And I know there's a lot of optimism in the room, so I also want to hear maybe what you're afraid of and what do you think could be holding back some of that change this time around, looking forward. Right, so to articulate myself, looking ahead, what are you excited about? What are you hopeful about? And also perhaps what are you fearful of?
I guess personally, I'm quite excited to see what sort of new forms of authentic assessment comes out of it. We do have a lot more open book style examination options that are going to be available, and we are advising staff on all of those different alternative exam possibilities. So I'm excited to see what sort of discussion comes around with that. That sort of roadshow is happening, I think, this coming week. So whilst we don't have a good grasp on it, just going back from feedback from last session, we have a good feeling that, you know, a lot of people are going to adopt these new forms of assessment. In terms of what I'm fearful of them, to be honest, I'm pretty optimistic this time around. And one example—
We've got so much more time.
Everything's already done.
It's everywhere.
Business processes. But yeah, quite optimistic this time around. But and one example is that we, for this session, we actually don't have any sort of live proctoring exams this session. So that's one change, and I think part of that change is because staff actually can kind of see that, you know, they don't need someone to actively invigilate their students who are, you know, taking final examinations.
Fantastic. Christine, Jasper?
One thing I think that this whole pandemic, you know, will change, especially in the way that we assess, at least for us here in the Philippines, is greater focus, I hope, on higher order thinking skills rather than just assessing lower order thinking. Because as we've also been pointing this out when we talk to teachers, also who have been asking for our help in the university on how to transition to online distance learning, is that they really need to be more intentional about choosing the learning competencies or learning objectives that are looking at higher order thinking. So we hope, I really hope that we see more exams or more tests that are focusing on those higher order thinking rather than just, you know, regurgitating knowledge and all those simple recall questions. So that's something that I'm really looking forward to, because many of our assessments really are very, very traditional. So a greater importance probably also on formative assessments. I hope that teachers also will come to value formative assessment and see that there is something here that can actually help our learners and help us as well as teachers. And I also want to point out, bringing back the point regarding cheating, I think if teachers have already embedded formative assessments in the teaching and learning process, then there's really a lot of opportunities for the students to build their efficacy and to build their knowledge as well through those formative assessments. And by the time they take the summative assessment, there's really no point to cheating because, you know, I've taken all these formative assessments. So what's the point of cheating? I know how to answer this. So that's my hope for the future.
Glad someone said that. I was just about to say that. Thank you so much, Christine. That was perfect. Absolutely perfect. What does that look like? We don't really know quite yet, but that's ultimately where we'd like to go. But that's great. I just like to think, I'm just really excited to see the future use of video and how that can be used, especially for, say, for instance, in the Philippines, not everyone might have access to a PC or a tablet. We might be using something else in a couple of years that allows us to do things even better in a handheld device as well. So taking that to the next level and using that in assessment purposes can be something very cool as well. So I'm fearful of nothing. It's all fun.
You're never fearful of anything. No fear. Jasper or Marianne, do you have any final words before we wrap up the webinar?
Because for us, we are looking forward for more. When we were training teachers in terms of instruction in the online distance environment, the core that we always emphasize is really interaction and collaboration. So we want teachers to also bring that core concept into assessment, okay? Because we want them to realize that if they're teaching collaboratively, then assessment should also be done collaboratively so that there's alignment between those processes. So we hope that in the future, our teachers would design more perhaps project-based assessment for their courses, okay? Not just to, again, measure the knowledge, but also how their students work with each other, because I think that's one of the core things and competencies that students have to be able to develop, and schools have to develop in them to make them ready for social integration later on. Yeah.
I think I'm excited at UTS for the completion of our Canvas rollout, because I think, you know, once staff have got that, I think that's going to make a big difference. I'm interested in, I think, seeing a move away from the final assessments as having to be exams. I think you're absolutely right, Jasper. There's so many other things that we could be doing, and really looking at assessment design, assessment for learning, rather than assessment just being some hurdle that we absolutely have to have here. I think that all of this is going to lead to a much richer, you know, more interesting environment for assessing learning. If I'm fearful of anything, I've got to be honest, I think that some of the financial challenges that our universities are going to have going forward, I think we're going to have to really take care to make sure that we're making good decisions despite financial constraints. I think that would be the thing that, you know, I'm a little bit fearful about.
Someone's going to end it on a better note than that. Come on.
Absolutely, I'm worried about that.
Everyone's like, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? What's happening?
Well, I mean, I think if we want a positive note to end it on, I mean, this conversation would probably have just been inconceivable 12 months ago. You know,
Yeah.
we wouldn't, we were nowhere in this space.
Yeah.
Huge leaps and bounds. And I think that the really exciting thing is we've brought with us groups of academic staff who would never have signed up for this, never have said they could do it. And they're there and they're doing it. And, you know, and it's working. So, I mean, I think that that's just, you know, it hasn't been a great year, but that's a great bit of it.
And I think also as well, just to kind of finish it off, I think there's a lot more, as you said, there was less complaints. I think also a lot of the community is a lot more patient with what's going on at the moment. Like, we are doing the best we can do with what we've got, disparaging of where we are in the education market. So I think that's a really important point to say. But we've gone a little over, but thank you so much, everyone. That was a really great discussion. And thank you, Logan, for putting everything together. Thank you so much. Emerson, Jasper, Marianne, and Christine, thank you so much for helping us out this afternoon. A copy of this recording will be available on the Canvas community, and we'll put any notes or anything like that. We can continue the discussion underneath that as well. But once again, thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. Some of the questions were great, and hopefully we're having a discussion one day about creating new assessment types to help make this actually happen. So once again, thank you, everyone, this afternoon, and we'll see you again soon. So stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.